Most empaths never reach the Sofia stage for one simple reason. They never stop giving long enough to question why they're giving in the first place. It becomes automatic, almost instinctive. They walk into a room and immediately start reading people, adjusting themselves, offering support, softening tension. Not because they're asked to, but because it feels like that's who they are. And over time, that behavior doesn't just become perie ve yero, chaka, aia, becomes identity. They start to believe their value is directly tied to how much they can carry, how much they can understand, how much they can tolerate, how much they can fix without breaking. And the more they do it, the more it reinforces the idea that this is their role. That being needed is the same as being valued. That being the one people rely on is somehow equal to being respected. But those two things are not the same. Because when your identity is built around constant emotional output, you don't leave any space for evaluation. You don't step back and ask, is this being returned? You don't measure the cost because you've convinced yourself there isn't one. You tell yourself this is just how you are. This is your strength. This is your purpose. But what it actually becomes is a loop where exhaustion feels normal, where being drained is expected, where silence feels uncomfortable because you're so used to filling it with effort. And the moment you try to step out of that loop even slightly, you feel it. That internal resistance, that quiet voice telling you you're being selfish, that you're changing, that you're not being who you're supposed to be. So you go back to overextending, back to explaining, fixing, adjusting, absorbing. Not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity is powerful. It keeps people locked in patterns long after those patterns have stopped serving them. And this is exactly why the Sofia stage feels so far away from most empaths. Because reaching it requires something that goes completely against everything they've practiced. It requires pulling back. It requires observing instead of immediately engaging. It requires asking hard questions about where their energy is going and what it's actually producing in return. And most importantly, it requires letting go of the idea that their worth is tied to their sacrifice. That's the part that stops most people. Because if you're not the one constantly giving, constantly showing up, constantly holding things together, then who are you? And that question creates discomfort. But that discomfort is necessary, because on the other side of it is clarity. The kind of clarity that shows you which connections are balanced and which ones only exist because of your effort. The kind of clarity that separates who truly values you from who simply benefits from you. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. And that's where the shift begins. Not in what you give, but in what you stop giving without question. Because the Sofia stage isn't reached by doing more. It's reached the moment you finally understand that not everything deserves your energy. And then there's a part most empaths avoid longer than anything else, the moment where they have to face the truth without softening it. Not the version of truth filtered through hope, or potential, or emotional attachment, but the raw, consistent reality of what's actually been happening in front of them the entire time. Because empaths have a tendency to see what could be instead of what is. They'll meet someone and sense depth, possibility, hidden layers that haven't fully surfaced yet. And instead of observing patterns over time, they begin investing in that potential early. They start filling in the gaps, explaining away inconsistencies, giving meaning to behavior that doesn't actually support it. And the more they invest emotionally, the harder it becomes to pull back and question it. Because now it's not just about the other person, it's about the story they've built around them. And walking away from that story feels like losing something real, even if it never fully existed. So they stay. They stay in conversations that don't go anywhere. They stay in relationships that feel one-sided. They stay in dynamics where they're constantly trying to understand someone who isn't trying to be understood. And every time something doesn't align, they don't immediately see it as a red flag, they see it as something to work through, something to fix, something that just needs a little more time. But time doesn't change patterns, clarity does. And clarity only comes when you're willing to stop negotiating with reality. That's the shift the Sofia stage demands. It requires you to look at behavior as it is, not as it could become. It requires you to stop translating someone's actions into something more comfortable and start taking them at face value. If someone is inconsistent, you see inconsistency. If someone avoids accountability, you see avoidance. If someone only shows up when it benefits them, you stop calling it coincidence. You call it what it is. And that level of honesty is uncomfortable at first because it removes the emotional cushion. It takes away the benefit of the doubt that empaths are so used to giving. It forces you to accept that some of the connections you believed in were never grounded in mutual effort. They were sustained by your willingness to believe in something more. And once you accept that, something changes. You stop chasing explanations. You stop needing closure in the form of long conversations or emotional breakthroughs. You stop trying to get people to see what they've already chosen not to see. Because you realize understanding someone doesn't obligate you to stay connected to them. That's where detachment begins. Not from a place of coldness, but from a place of precision. You're no longer reacting to what you hope something can become, you're responding to what it consistently shows you it is. And that shift removes confusion. It removes the constant second-guessing, the internal debates, the emotional back and forth. Everything becomes simpler, not easier but clearer. And with that clarity comes a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't need to argue, doesn't need to convince, doesn't need to hold on just to prove something can work. You see the pattern and you decide accordingly. And most empaths never reach this point. Not because they can't, but because it requires letting go of the version of reality they've been emotionally attached to for far too long. Because the Sofia stage doesn't begin when you understand people better. It begins when you stop misunderstanding them on purpose. And then there's the part that's hardest to admit, because it doesn't look like a weakness on the surface, it actually feels like depth. But for many empaths, what keeps them stuck isn't just their willingness to give, it's their attachment to the emotional intensity itself. They don't just experience emotions, they live inside them. The highs feel meaningful, the deep conversations, the moments of connection, the feeling of being understood or understanding someone on a level most people never reach, that becomes something they crave. And then come the lows. The confusion, the distance, the tension, the need to figure out what went wrong. And instead of stepping back, they lean in even more, trying to solve it, trying to restore that emotional high they felt before. And without realizing it, they get caught in a cycle. Because the intensity becomes the hook. It's no longer just about the person or the situation, it's about the emotional experience that comes with it. The unpredictability, the ups and downs, the constant shift between closeness and distance, it creates a kind of pull that feels important, almost addictive. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle, repeated pattern that keeps them engaged long after logic would say step away. And this is where most empaths lose control without realizing it. Because they believe they're staying for connection, but they're actually staying for the feeling. The feeling of trying to understand. The feeling of being needed. The feeling of chasing clarity in something that never fully settles. And every time they get a small moment of reassurance, a brief return to that emotional high, it resets the cycle. It gives just enough reward to keep them invested, but that's not stability, that's dependency. And the Sofia stage requires something completely different. It requires emotional neutrality. Not the absence of feeling, but the ability to experience emotion without being pulled by it. The ability to observe what's happening without immediately reacting, without needing to fix it, chase it, or hold on to it. And for someone who's used to living in emotional depth, that kind of control feels unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because it feels like detachment. But it's not detachment from others, it's detachment from the need for emotional intensity to define the connection. It's the ability to stay steady whether things are high or low. To not be pulled into chaos just because it feels significant. To recognize that consistency, not intensity, is what actually builds something real. And once that shift happens, the entire pattern breaks. Because now, those emotional highs that used to feel so powerful, they don't have the same effect. And the lows that used to pull you in deeper, they don't trap you the same way. You see them for what they are, temporary states, not reasons to stay invested. And that clarity changes your decisions. You stop choosing based on how something feels in the moment, and you start choosing based on what it consistently produces over time. You stop chasing emotional spikes and start valuing emotional stability. And that alone separates you from the cycle that kept you stuck. But most empaths never reach this point, because they never question the intensity, they trust it. They believe that because something feels deep, it must be meaningful. That because something is emotionally complex, it must be worth their time. But depth without stability is just another form of chaos. And the Sofia stage isn't built on chaos, it's built on control. Because the moment you stop needing to feel everything so intensely is the moment you finally start seeing everything clearly. And then we get to the point where most empaths think they've done the work because they understand boundaries. They can explain them, they can communicate them, they can even recognize when those boundaries are being crossed. On the surface, it looks like growth, it feels like progress. But there's a difference between knowing a boundary and enforcing it. And that difference is where most people get stuck. Because setting a boundary once is easy. You say what you need, you explain your limits, you make it clear what you will and won't accept. But what happens next is what actually defines everything. Because the moment that boundary gets tested, and it will get tested, most empaths hesitate. They pause. They second guess. They start thinking about the other person's perspective, their intentions, their past, their struggles. They begin to rationalize why the line was crossed instead of responding to the fact that it was. And in that hesitation, the boundary loses its strength, because a boundary that isn't enforced isn't a boundary, it's a suggestion. And people learn that quickly. They learn that if they push just a little, if they apologize in a certain way, if they wait long enough or say the right thing, the line will move. Not because the empath wants it to move, but because they don't want to create conflict. They don't want to seem harsh or unforgiving. They don't want to be misunderstood, so they bend. And every time they bend, they reinforce a pattern that works against them. Because now, it's not just about the other person crossing the line, it's about the expectation that the line can be crossed, that it's flexible, that it depends on mood, timing, or explanation. And once that expectation is set, it becomes the new normal. This is why so many empaths feel like they're constantly repeating themselves. They've said what they need, they've explained it clearly, but they haven't backed it with consistent action. And without action, words lose weight. Over time, people stop taking those boundaries seriously, not out of malice, but because they've been shown they don't have to. And this is exactly what prevents the shift into the Sofia stage. Because the Sofia stage isn't built on communication alone, it's built on consistency. It's built on the ability to respond the same way every time a boundary is crossed, without emotional hesitation. No long explanations, no repeated warnings, no internal debate, just a clear decision, followed by a clear action. And that level of consistency sends a message that doesn't need to be explained. It makes the boundary real. But reaching that point requires something most empaths struggle with. It requires letting go of the need to be seen as understanding in every moment. It requires accepting that enforcing a boundary might make someone uncomfortable, might even make them walk away, and being okay with that outcome. Because without that willingness, enforcement never happens. And without enforcement, nothing changes. So the cycle continues: clear communication followed by inconsistent action, followed by repeated frustration. And eventually it leads to the same question over and over again. Why does this keep happening to me? But the answer is always in the pattern. Because people don't just respond to what you say, they respond to what you consistently allow. And until those two things align, the boundary will never hold. Because the Sofia stage isn't reached when you learn how to set boundaries. It's reached the moment you stop making exceptions to them. And then we arrive at the final barrier, the one that keeps more empaths stuck than anything else. Because it feels like a threat to who they are. It's the fear of becoming cold. Not distant in a healthy way, not grounded or selective, but cold, uncaring, unfeeling. Someone they don't recognize. Because for so long their identity has been built around being the one who feels deeply, who shows up, who understands when others don't. That's been their strength, their role, their sense of purpose. So the idea of stepping back, of limiting access, of choosing where their energy goes, it feels like they're losing that part of themselves. And that fear keeps them in place. They tell themselves, this is just who I am. They believe that if they become more selective, more controlled, more detached, they'll stop being empathetic altogether. That they'll lose their ability to connect, to care, to make a difference in people's lives. But that belief is built on a misunderstanding. Because the Sofia stage isn't about removing empathy, it's about refining it. It's about taking something that was once automatic and making it intentional. It's about choosing when to engage, when to step back, when to invest, and when to observe. It's not about feeling less, it's about letting those feelings serve you instead of control you. But most empaths never experience this, because they never move past the fear. They stay in a version of themselves that feels safe, even if it's draining. They keep overextending, overgiving, over-involving themselves in situations that don't require their energy, all to avoid the discomfort of being seen differently. To avoid the possibility that someone might say, you've changed. And the truth is they have, but not in the way they fear. They haven't become cold, they become clear. Clear about what they will and won't tolerate. Clear about who deserves their energy and who doesn't. Clear about the difference between caring and carrying. And that clarity changes how they show up in every area of their life. They stop trying to prove their kindness through sacrifice. They stop measuring their worth by how much they can endure. They stop confusing emotional availability with emotional responsibility. And instead, they begin to operate from a place of control. They can still connect deeply, but now it's mutual. They can still support others, but not at the cost of themselves. They can still feel everything, but they're no longer overwhelmed by it. And from the outside, that shift can look like distance. It can look like they've pulled back, like they've become harder to reach, harder to read. But what's really happening is simple: they've stopped giving unlimited access to something that was always meant to be protected. And once that realization sets in, there's no going back, because they understand now that empathy was never meant to be an open door for everyone. It was meant to be a tool, used with awareness. And the Sofia stage begins the moment that tool is no longer used out of habit, but out of choice.